So let's take what we've learned so far and plot both the dynamic aggregate demand curve and the solo growth curve or long run aggregate supply curve, both on the same graph. Assuming a long run growth rate or potential growth rate of 3%, we can use these two curves to identify what the economy's inflation rate will be in the long run. So let's just suppose this is an inflation rate of about 2.5%. So given spending growth and given the economy's long-run potential, we see that this economy is expected to experience about 2.5% inflation every year and a growth rate of 3%. Now, let's suppose in the course of the next few years we have a series of positive and negative economic shocks, real shocks to the economy. But on net, the shocks result in positive economic growth. So we have enough real shocks to compensate us for the negative shocks, and so the solo growth curve shifts out to the right. Notice what this says. If spending does not change, so the aggregate demand curve has not changed, and so we continue to have the same level of spending growth, the real growth in the economy will increase our potential growth rate, let's say to 4%, and notice that it will lower the economy's inflation rate, let's say from 2.5% to 1%. Okay, so this is the inflation rate that we would expect to hold in the economy given spending growth as well as our potential growth rate. So positive economic shock is going to increase the growth rate in the economy and lower the inflation rate. If we have a negative economic shock, so think about the oil crisis from the early 1970s, where the negative shocks outweighed the positive shocks. Now you're talking about a shift to the left in the long run aggregate supply curve. Starting from, let's say, our initial equilibrium here, the result is going to be a higher expected inflation rate. Okay, in this case maybe the inflation rate will rise to 4%, but notice what we have too is a slowdown in the economy, and in the case of what we went through, and that led to a recession, so we actually had negative economic growth. So real shocks are going to affect both the inflation rate as well as the economy's growth rate. Now we're going to use the same model to show why money is neutral in the long run. So assume here we're currently in equilibrium, but then the Fed, the Federal Reserve, decides to increase the monetary growth rate. Now this is going to affect the level of spending or the spending growth rate. When that happens, an increase in spending growth is going to shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. Now let's quickly review how that change in monetary growth is going to affect our economy. Assuming this is the only thing that changed, let's revisit our quantity equation. Since we're assuming the only thing that affected spending was the change in the monetary growth rate, we're assuming no change in velocity. And since there wasn't any real shock to the economy, there wasn't anything that was going to affect our ability to produce goods and services, we don't expect this growth rate to change. And so what this ends up being is that if you increase the monetary supply growth rate, it's strictly going to lead to inflation. And that's what this graph is showing us, right? In this case, at the new equilibrium, we still have a 3% growth rate. That has not changed, but now the inflation rate is going to shift up proportionally with the increase in the growth rate of the monetary supply. So let's just suppose in this case it shifts up to 4%. Again, this would happen in the long run. This assumes that there's been a long enough time for prices to adjust. That means both final goods prices as well as wages. And finally, if you're talking about a monetary contraction, that would lead to a decrease in spending growth. So if the Fed decides to slow down the growth of the money supply, you would have the opposite. The slowdown in the money supply will lead to a reduction in the inflation rate, or what we know as disinflation, potentially even deflation if they decrease it too much. But let's just look at, in this case, disinflation. So we have the disinflation and absolutely no effect on the economy's potential growth rate. So the economy is continuing to grow. I want you to realize that. It's just that it's continued to just chug along at 3%. But now, because of the monetary growth contraction, there is a lower inflation rate. So there's a lot of neat stuff that we can do with this model. There's still one piece that we need to talk about, and that is why the economy in the short run does not always grow at 3%. Sometimes it grows a lot faster, sometimes a lot slower. So in the third video lecture, we'll address that question by introducing what's known as the short run aggregate supply curve. That's it. Have a good one.